The doctor's voice was measured, clinical, the kind of calm that only exists when someone has rehearsed terrible news enough times to flatten it. But nothing could flatten what he said next. Esther wasn't losing the fight, Dr. Mensah said quietly, setting down the chart like it was made of glass. She was refusing to win it. Adolfredo's breath stopped somewhere in his chest and never finished the journey. The transplant had been available for 11 weeks. 11 weeks of viable tissue, of surgical windows, of nurses watching Esther decline while a solution sat waiting like an unanswered prayer. She had refused every consent form. Every single one. And she'd sworn the medical team to silence, invoking her patient rights with the kind of quiet precision that told Adolfredo she'd thought this through long before the illness had even peaked. She said, Dr. Mensah hesitated, and that hesitation nearly destroyed him. She said she didn't want to chain you to a life you were trying to leave. The room tilted. Adolfredo gripped the edge of the bed frame, knuckles going white, because if he didn't hold on to something physical, he was certain he would simply come apart. Every late night he'd pulled away. Every clipped phone call. Every unanswered message where he'd told himself he needed space, distance, freedom. She had felt all of it. She had catalogued his silence and drawn the only conclusion a woman who loved him completely would draw. He was leaving. So she decided not to make him stay. When his voice broke on the word, he tried again. When was the last form? The final one. Dr. Mensah checked his notes, though something in his expression suggested he already knew. 3 weeks ago. Tuesday. Around 7 in the evening. Tuesday. 7 in the evening. Adolfredo pulled out his phone with shaking hands, scrolled to the message thread, and there it was, time-stamped, permanent, unforgivable. His goodbye message sent at 7:04 p.m. She had been holding the pen when it arrived. He sank into the chair beside her bed, her small hand limp in both of his, and that's when the monitor above her head emitted a sound, one long, unbroken tone, and every nurse in the hallway started running. If you're watching part 2, thank you for being here. But to fully understand the story, the choices, the emotions, and the shocking moments, you need to watch part 1 too. That's where everything truly began. After this, go back and watch part 1. And if you enjoyed the story, please like this video and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Now, the penthouse smelled like Camila, expensive perfume and ambition baked into the walls. Adolfredo moved through it like a man already grieving, and maybe that's exactly what he was. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. Camila appeared at the top of the stairs in silk and certainty, a glass of wine balanced between 2 fingers like a scepter. She read his face and the glass came down slowly. Whatever you're thinking, she said, don't. He was already thinking it. He moved to the safe behind the painting, her painting, the one she'd chosen, the one she'd hung like a flag of conquest, and began pulling out documents. Account access cards. Signed authorizations that bore her name. The property key fob she'd been carrying so long she'd probably forgotten it wasn't hers. Adolfredo. Her voice sharpened. Stop. He didn't stop. Those accounts run half your operations. You pull my access, everything stalls, the shipments, the contacts in Medellin. Then it stalls. He said it without looking up. She descended the stairs slowly, each step deliberate, performative. She still believed in the power of her presence. He'd taught her that. He'd been wrong too. I made you a king. The words landed like she'd been saving them for years, polished and ready. You were nothing before me. A soldier with ambition and no direction. I gave you shape. I gave you this. She gestured to the marble, the skyline, the empire framed in glass, all of this. He finally turned. And what she saw in his face made her step back. I was a king, he said quietly, because I had someone worth building for. Every wall in this empire has her fingerprints on the foundation, and she never touched a single brick. His jaw tightened. You gave me ambition, Camila. She gave me a reason. And I was too blind to know the difference until she was lying in a hospital bed dying to set me free. He dropped the key fob on the floor between them. Without her, I'm just a man with a gun and a lonely room. He walked to the door. And that man has no use for you. He was halfway down the corridor when his phone rang. It was the hospital. They came to him because they had no choice. Contracts needing signatures. Territory disputes bleeding into violence. A shipment stalled at the border with 48 hours before it became someone else's problem. His lieutenants arrived one by one at Mercy General Hospital, stepping over the threshold in tailored jackets and polished shoes, completely unprepared for what they found. Adolfredo. In a plastic chair. Reading a letter. Not reviewing intel. Not issuing orders. Reading a letter, his voice low, unhurried, the words rising and falling like a man trying to build a bridge between this world and wherever Esther's mind was drifting. Marco, his most senior enforcer, a man who'd watched Adolfredo execute a betrayal without blinking, stood frozen in the doorway for a full 10 seconds before quietly passing the contract to a nurse and asking her to leave it on the chair beside him. Nobody laughed. Not once. Not even behind closed doors. Because fear evolves. And what they felt watching him was something older and deeper than the fear he'd spent 20 years manufacturing. It was the fear of witnessing a powerful man completely undone, and knowing that even power has a thing it cannot fight. He read her everything. The letters she'd written him during the early years, folded into quarters and carried in his jacket pocket so long the creases had gone soft. He described the apartment they'd shared, the one with the radiator that clanged at 3 a.m. and the window that only opened halfway. 2 shirts. A leather jacket. A woman who laughed at his ambition and believed in it anyway. You used to say the leather jacket made me look like a man with a plan, he said, his thumb tracing the back of her still hand. I only had one plan. It was always you. The monitor kept its steady rhythm. The machines breathed for her where she couldn't breathe for herself. He leaned closer. The transplant window closes in 72 hours, Esther. After that, his voice fractured. He studied it with visible effort. After that, there's nothing left to consent to. Her fingers didn't move. But somewhere down the corridor, a door opened, and a doctor approached with an expression that didn't belong on a face delivering good news. Word travels fast in a city built on fear. And the word that traveled fastest that week was this: Adolfredo had gone soft. The Reyes faction moved on a Tuesday. 3 warehouses in the South Quarter, 2 distribution points near the port, and a money house that had operated quietly under Adolfredo's protection for 6 years. They didn't burn anything. They didn't need to. They simply arrived and replaced one flag with another, the way opportunists always do, quickly, quietly, betting that a distracted king wouldn't notice until it was too late. They had profoundly misunderstood the nature of distraction. Adolfredo received the news at 11 p.m., sitting in his plastic chair, Esther's hand in his. He didn't stand. He didn't raise his voice. He asked Marco for a phone, dialed a number from memory, and waited 3 rings. Reyes. The name left his mouth like a door closing. The silence on the other end lasted exactly long enough to confirm the man knew he'd been caught. What followed wasn't a threat. Threats imply uncertainty. Adolfredo's voice carried none. It was flat, almost gentle, the tone of a man describing weather. He outlined, with surgical precision, every member of the Reyes family currently living above ground. Their addresses. Their habits. The school one of them attended on Wednesdays. He recited these details the way a man reads a grocery list, without pleasure, without anger, without any of the performance that violence usually requires. I'm not at war with you, Adolfredo said finally. I'm sitting in a hospital room trying to keep my wife alive. And the only thing standing between your family and a very quiet end is the fact that I need this hallway to stay peaceful. He paused. Give me noise, and I'll have nothing left to lose. Do you understand what I'm telling you? By morning, every warehouse had been returned. No negotiation. No counteroffer. Just 3 locations quietly vacated, as if the Reyes faction had never arrived at all. His lieutenants said nothing. But they looked at him differently, not with the respect born from watching a man win a fight, but the deeper, colder respect born from watching a man not need to. Inside room 14, the transplant clock read 41 hours. And Esther's fever was climbing. He hadn't meant to look at her phone. It had been sitting on the bedside table since the night he arrived, her cracked screen, outdated, stubbornly uncharged phone that she'd refused to replace for 3 years because it still works. Adolfredo, not everything needs to be new. He'd found her charger in her bag, plugged it in without thinking, and set it back down like a reflex. It buzzed at 6 a.m. Not a call. Not a notification from the outside world. A scheduled message, drafted months ago, set to deliver on a date she had chosen with full knowledge of what that date might mean. The phone had simply waited, patient and obedient, for the moment its owner could no longer speak for herself. He read the first line and stopped breathing. Asterisk, my love. If this reached you, then things went the way I was afraid they might. Please don't be angry. You always led with anger when you were scared, and I need you to skip that part this time. Asterisk. His hands were shaking before he reached the second paragraph. She had written him instructions. Not goodbyes, instructions. The heart medication he perpetually forgot. Second shelf, bathroom cabinet, take with food or it will wreck your stomach, I mean it. The spare key to the old apartment on Calle Mirador, tucked behind the loose brick on the left side of the entrance. I kept it because I always thought we'd go back someday, even just to stand in it. The name and number of a therapist she'd researched quietly. Written out in full, with a note beside it. Asterisk, you don't have to be broken to need someone to talk to. You just have to be human. Asterisk. And at the very end, in the unsteady handwriting of someone who had cried while typing and kept going anyway. Asterisk, be kind to yourself. You were never as hard as you pretended. I always knew. I was always proud. I loved the leather jacket version of you most of all. Asterisk. Adolfredo pressed the phone against his chest and made a sound he hadn't made since he was 9 years old. Marco, standing guard outside, heard it through the door and stepped away to give him the hallway. It was only when Adolfredo finally lowered the phone that he noticed it. The monitor beside Esther had changed its rhythm. Dr. Mensah was already running. It happened in seconds. One moment the monitor was cycling through its altered rhythm, irregular, concerning, but still a rhythm, and the next it screamed. One sustained, merciless tone that cut through the quiet of the ward like a blade through silk. Adolfredo was on his feet before his mind caught up with his body, her phone still clutched in his hand, her last words still warm in his chest. Then the door burst open, and they came, 3 nurses, then 2 doctors, then Dr. Mensah moving with a focused urgency that left no room for anything except the crisis consuming the center of the room. A nurse caught Adolfredo by the arm. Young, steady, immovable. Sir, you have to wait outside. That's my wife. Sir, not unkind. Absolute. Outside. Now. The door closed in his face. He stood in the hallway of Mercy General at 6:17 in the morning and understood, with a totality that no amount of power had ever prepared him for, that he was completely helpless. Behind that door, a team of people were fighting for Esther's life with tools and knowledge he didn't possess, in a language he couldn't speak, and there was nothing he could do but stand on the wrong side of it. The code blue announcement rolled through the intercom overhead, calm and procedural, the way catastrophe always sounds in hospitals. Marco arrived at the end of the corridor within minutes. Then 2 more of his men. Word moved fast even at dawn. They lined the hallway in silence, these men who'd watched him dismantle rivals and command rooms and bend entire districts to his will, and not one of them moved toward him, because they understood instinctively that there was no gesture equal to this moment. Adolfredo pressed his back against the wall and slid down it until he was sitting on the floor. All of it, the warehouses, the accounts, The fear he'd spent 2 decades cultivating across this city, none of it purchased one extra second of her breath. Not one. He'd built an empire with his bare hands, and it couldn't open that door. The flatline tone continued for 4 seconds longer than it should have. Then it stopped. And the silence that replaced it was the most terrifying sound he had ever heard. He found the chapel by accident, or maybe not. It was tucked at the end of a corridor he'd never taken, past the pediatric ward and a wall of crayon drawings made by children who'd been scared and found ways to make color out of it anyway. A small wooden sign. A half-open door. Inside, 12 plastic chairs, a modest altar, and a silence so different from the hallway silence that it stopped him in the doorway. Adolfredo Moretti had not entered a house of God in 23 years. The last time, he'd been 17, sitting in a pew at his mother's funeral, already hollowed out, already deciding that a world which operated like this one did not deserve his reverence. He stepped inside anyway. The chapel was empty. One candle burning near the front, almost finished, the wax pooled and trembling. He stood before the altar for a long moment, this man whose name moved through the city like weather, whose silence alone had ended careers and lives, and something in him cracked so cleanly it made no sound at all. He knelt. Not carefully. Not with the measured dignity he brought to every room he entered. He went down hard on both knees on that unforgiving floor and pressed his clasped hands against his mouth, and he didn't speak for almost a full minute because he was trying to find the language for something that lived below language. When it came, it wasn't eloquent. "I'm not asking you to spare her because she's good," he said, his voice stripped of everything. She's the best person I've ever destroyed slowly without meaning to. But that's not why." He drew a breath that shook. "I'm asking because I have nothing worth keeping if she isn't in the world. Take the empire. Take the name. Take every year I've got left above ground. Divide them however you want." His jaw tightened against the emotion climbing his throat. "Just let her open her eyes one more time. Let me tell her what I should have said before I sent that message. One more time. That's the whole bargain." The candle guttered. Nearly went out. Then steadied. He was still on his knees when Marco appeared in the doorway, face unreadable. "She's out of the flatline," he said. He paused. "But Adolfredo, Camila's here." Her eyelids moved first. It was so small, just a flutter, like something waking slowly from a very long distance, that Adolfredo almost missed it. He'd been sitting forward in the plastic chair, elbows on knees, her hand cupped in both of his, when the flutter became a struggle and the struggle became her eyes opening, unfocused, then slowly pulling the room into frame. She found his face. And the thing that broke him completely was that she smiled. Not a confused smile. Not the disoriented grimace of someone surfacing through medication and trauma. A real smile, small and tired and entirely Esther, the smile of a woman who had opened her eyes and found exactly who she expected to find, and felt safe because of it. "You look terrible," she whispered. He laughed, and the laugh came out wrong, fractured at the edges, but she didn't seem to notice or she didn't mind. He pressed her hand to his lips and held it there long enough that she reached up with her free hand and touched his hair the way she always had, gentle, automatic, the gesture of 20 years compressed into a single motion. Dr. Mensah ran his assessments quietly, professionally, asking Esther careful questions between the relief filling the room. Her answers were clear, oriented, sharp. She remembered her name, the year, the hospital. She did not remember the last 48 hours. The doctor explained it gently, temporary lacunar amnesia, not uncommon after a cardiac event of this severity. The memory may return in fragments or not at all, and Adolfredo sat very still while he listened, understanding exactly what was being handed to him. A door. She didn't know about the message. Didn't know about the goodbye he'd sent while she was holding a pen above a consent form. Didn't know that her heart had stopped partly because he had told her, without knowing he was telling her, that leaving was something he was capable of. She just looked at him like he was the reason she'd bothered to come back. "Stay," she asked, her voice still thin. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. And he meant it with every broken piece of himself. But across the room, his phone lit up with a message from Camila. Tell her. Or I will, asterisk. He waited until the nurses were gone. Until the ward quieted to its nighttime frequency, the distant beeping, the soft shoes on linoleum, the particular hush of a building full of people fighting private battles. He waited until it was just the two of them and the single lamp in the corner casting everything in amber, and then he pulled his chair close and leaned forward and said her name the way he used to say it before the Empire taught him to be careful with softness. "Esther, I need to tell you something." She read his face the way she'd always read it, completely, immediately, with the patience of a woman who had spent 2 decades learning a language nobody else spoke. Her expression didn't change. She just waited. He told her everything. Not the edited version. Not the version shaped to protect himself or land more gently. He told her about Camila, not just the affair, but the years of it, the way he'd let ambition dress itself up as love and never examined the costume. He told her about the message, the exact words, the timestamp he'd burned into memory. He told her what the doctor had said about the consent forms, that she'd been holding the pen, and he watched her face as he said it and did not look away because she deserved someone who could bear to watch the truth land. When he finished, the room held it all. He sat back. Shoulders dropped. 20 years of scaffolding finally down. "I know I don't get to ask for anything after this," he said. "I just couldn't let you look at me the way you've been looking at me and not tell you what I actually am." Esther was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached out and took his hands, his scarred, calloused, empire-built hands, and turned them over slowly in hers, the way you examine something old and complicated that you've chosen to keep anyway. "I already knew all," she said softly. "About all of it." She met his eyes. "I was just waiting for you to remember who you were." The relief that moved through him was almost violent. Then her monitor spiked, not in distress, but the door opened, and Dr. Mensah entered with a face carrying news too large for the room. "The donor organ just became available," he said. "We have 4 hours." He made the calls from the hospital parking lot while Esther was in surgery. 7 calls. 31 years of architecture, dismantled in under 2 hours. He didn't use intermediaries or coded language or any of the elaborate machinery of distance he'd spent decades constructing. He called each man directly, spoke plainly, and said the same thing in 7 different ways. "It's over, and here is what happens next." Marco took it the hardest. Stood in the parking lot in person, he'd driven over without being asked, as if he'd sensed it coming, and listened with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, the posture of a man absorbing a blow he'd been half expecting for years. "The warehouses go legitimate," Adolfredo said. "Cold storage and freight. There's more money in it than you think, and nobody comes for your family at 3 a.m. He handed Marco a folder, prepared quietly over the past week, somewhere between vigils and chapel floors. Legal frameworks. Transition contacts. A lawyer whose number Esther had written in the margin of an old notebook, because of course she'd already been quietly building him a door out. "The South Quarter operation funds the transition for 18 months, Adolfredo continued. "After that, it sustains itself or it folds. Nobody inherits the Moretti name. It ends with me." Marco looked at the folder for a long time. "And if someone moves on us during the transition? Before we're strong enough the legitimate way. Then you handle it the legitimate way." Adolfredo held his gaze. "And if that's not enough, you call me. But I won't be calling from the same life I was living. Are we clear?" Marco nodded slowly. "Once." The way men nod when they're agreeing to something that will require them to become someone different. One by one the others confirmed. Some with relief so obvious it was almost embarrassing. Some with the careful neutrality of men already calculating their next move. One with silence that lasted long enough to mean either acceptance or something more dangerous. Adolfredo noted the silence. Filed it. He went back inside at noon. Sat down in the plastic chair outside the operating theater. Pressed Esther's phone against his chest. 4 hours became 6. 6 became 8. At hour 9, the surgeon's face appeared around the door and Adolfredo couldn't read it. The toaster was winning. It had been winning for 3 mornings in a row, and Adolfredo, who had once negotiated the surrender of an entire district without raising his voice, was losing his patience with a kitchen appliance in a way that felt both absurd and completely appropriate for the life he was now living. "It burns the left side every time," he announced to no one. "That's because you keep using the high setting," Esther said, walking in. He turned around. A year later, and it still did something to him, seeing her upright, moving through morning light, her hand resting briefly on the door frame with the casual ease of someone who understood that standing in a kitchen was a gift and had decided to treat it like one. Her wedding ring caught the sun coming through the window above the sink and threw a small arc of light across the second-hand table, the same one they'd carried up 3 flights of stairs the week they moved back in. She looked healthy. She looked like herself. She looked like the answer to every bargain he'd ever made on a chapel floor. She handed him her phone. "You got a message." He frowned his message on her phone, then looked at the screen. Rosa. A photo, grainy and small, the edges soft with age and scanning. 20 years collapsed into a single image, the two of them standing outside the old building on Calle Mirador, young and broke and leaning into each other with the unself-conscious ease of people who don't yet know how much they'll be tested. His leather jacket. Her laugh caught mid-motion, head tilted back. He looked at it for a long time. "We were so young," he said. "You still make the same face when you're worried," she said. He looked up. She was smiling, not the tired hospital smile, not the brave smile she'd worn through the worst of the year. This one was unguarded, morning warm, entirely hers. He set the phone down. And then he saw it. On the table. Half tucked beneath the fruit bowl as if placed there carefully or nervously. A small white envelope unsealed. Not a legal document. Not a threat. Not a summons from any world he used to occupy. He looked at Esther. She wasn't smiling anymore. She was crying. And so was he. He picked up the envelope with hands that had once been steady enough to sign death warrants without trembling. They were trembling now. The pregnancy test inside was small and ordinary, and the most extraordinary thing he had ever held. 2 lines. Unambiguous. The kind of result that doesn't negotiate or soften itself for the person receiving it, it simply is, and it waits for the world to reorganize itself around the fact of it. Adolfredo set it down on the table very carefully, as if it might change its mind. "Esther." "I know," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "The doctors said." "I know what the doctors said." He looked at her. Really looked, the way he'd looked at her through the hospital glass, through the chapel candle, through every version of almost losing her that the last year had reconstructed him around. Her eyes were wet, but her jaw was steady, and he recognized that combination because it was the same face she'd worn the day she'd told him about refusing the transplant. The face of a woman who had already sat alone with something enormous and made a kind of peace with it before letting anyone else into the room. "They said the original heart couldn't survive a pregnancy," she said. They were right. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum, gently, reverently. "The way you touch something new that you're still learning belongs to you. But this isn't the original heart." The sentence moved through him like a current. 23 years they had carried that grief quietly between them, the children that the doctors had gently, permanently, ruled impossible. It had never been discussed much because there are some losses that live below discussion, settled into the foundation of a marriage like load-bearing weight. He had never once let himself want it out loud because wanting it felt like cruelty to them both. And now, he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her face in both hands and pressed his forehead against hers, and neither of them spoke because language had reached its limit. Outside, the South Quarter was waking up, ordinary and unhurried, buses and bread and children already late for school. Then Esther pulled back, just slightly, something shifting in her expression. "Adal," she said carefully. "I called Dr. Mensah this morning." She paused. "He wants to see us both. Today. He set his tone, he said to bring you." Dr. Mensah's office smelled the same as it always had, antiseptic and coffee, and the particular gravity of rooms where important things get said. Adalfredo sat in the chair across the desk with Esther's hand locked in his and watched the doctor's face with the focused attention of a man who had learned, the hard way, to read expressions before words arrived. Mensah opened the file, closed it, opened it again. "The transplanted heart is performing beyond anything we projected," he began. "The tissue integration is, frankly, it's remarkable. In 15 years, I have not seen a result this clean." He looked at Esther directly. "Your body accepted it as if it was always supposed to be there." Adalfredo exhaled slowly. "And the pregnancy?" he asked. Mensah laced his fingers together. "High risk. I won't minimize that. There are monitoring requirements, restrictions, a surgical plan already in place for delivery. There will be hard days." He paused. "But the heart can carry this, Esther." With the right care, he allowed himself something close to a smile. "I believe it can carry this." The room went very quiet. Esther made a sound beside him, not a sob, not quite, something older and more complicated than crying, and Adalfredo brought her hand to his mouth and held it there while she put herself back together, the way he should have been doing for years, steady and present and entirely hers. They walked home. Not because they had to, the car was there. Marco had long since moved on, but old habits die slowly. But because the morning was clean and the South Quarter was ordinary in the way only genuinely lived-in places can be. And ordinary had become the most precious texture of their days. At the corner before their building, Adalfredo stopped. There was a small park, iron fence, 3 benches, a stretch of patchy grass that the city had never quite gotten around to fixing properly. Children were already there despite the early hour, chasing each other in the loose, joyful logic of people too young to know that life will eventually ask them to be serious. He watched them for a long moment. This. Not the skyline. Not the empire. Not the fear he'd once worn like a second skin. This, laughing and ordinary and entirely unafraid. He turned to Esther, took her hand, placed it over his heart, felt it beat. "Hello," he whispered. "Forever."